I'm Professor Delcianna Winders, Director of the Vermont Law School Animal Law and Policy Institute. Like almost all kids, I grew up loving animals. So when I was 7 years old and Marine World came to my hometown in Vallejo, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was very excited to see the animals there. My family got season passes, and at Marine World, I was kissed by an orca. I rode an elephant, and I watched a chimpanzee ride a tricycle around a baby elephant. I had no idea that these animals were suffering. Humans have been using animals for entertainment for centuries. Just down the road from Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was Bear Gardens, where bears, bulls, chimpanzees, and other animals were forced to fight to the death. The very same patrons who went to the Globe Theatre also went to Bear Gardens. Today, the cruelty is much less obvious in most of our entertainment using animals, but it is still present. It wasn't until after law school, when I went to work at public interest law for Meyer Glitzenstein and worked on captive elephant issues, that I realized the suffering inherent in using animals for entertainment, especially captive wild animals. It was also then that I realized how much the Animal Welfare Act, which is supposed to protect animals who are used for entertainment, has failed them. While at Meyer Glitzenstein, I worked to develop a case in partnership with others that led to the first ever elephant seizure in the United States. Tina and Jewel were seized by the federal government, but not because of Animal Welfare Act violations, although those certainly were present. Instead, Tina and Jewel were seized because they were purchased and sold without permits in violation of the Federal Endangered Species Act. At Meyer Glitzenstein, I was also part of the Ringling Brothers trial team, litigating a case under the Endangered Species Act in 2009. Ringling Brothers had been abusing elephants for years, including abuse that repeatedly resulted in deaths. Ricardo was just 8 months old when he died. Ricardo's mother, Shirley, was chained by her legs when she gave birth to him. She tried to reach out to him, and he was taken away from her immediately. Ringling Brothers started training Ricardo when he was just 3 months old. Training elephants to perform for the circus is training elephants in terror. Elephants and other wild animals don't perform because they want to. They perform because they're afraid not to. They perform because they know they will suffer serious, painful repercussions if they don't do exactly as they're told. For elephants, this training relies on the use of a device called a bullhook or an ankus. This is a bullhook. It belonged to a former circus handler. The bullhook has a sharp metal hook on the end, as well as a point. It is used on the most sensitive parts of elephants' bodies. Contrary to popular belief, elephants have very sensitive skin. So much so that in the wild, elephants make tools to get flies off of their backs because the flies' bites are painful. On some parts of their bodies, elephant skin is paper thin. So circuses also use something called wonder dust, a gray powder that covers up the wounds and the blood from circus handlers puncturing elephant skin with a bullhook. The bullhook is used on the most sensitive parts of them, under their chin, in their armpits, in the groin, on the genitals, behind the knees. The pain inflicted by the bullhook prompts the elephants to move in the desired direction. Once they've been trained, the bullhook can be kept out of the public eye, but visible to the elephant, a constant reminder of what they'll face once backstage if they don't do exactly as they're told. Ricardo began having knee problems, yet his training continued. He then fell from a circus pedestal during a training session and shattered both of his hind legs. He was euthanized. Ringling Brothers told the public, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which investigated for Animal Welfare Act violations, that Ricardo was simply playing when his legs shattered. But it came out in our lawsuit that Ringling Brothers was lying. Under oath, Ricardo's trainer admitted that actually he was training Ricardo when his legs shattered, and that he was using a bullhook as well as a rope around Ricardo's trunk to partially asphyxiate and control him. Kenny was also a baby when he died with Ringling Brothers. He was sick. He hadn't had any water for about 18 hours. He was shaky. He had trouble standing and walking. He had bloody diarrhea. Yet he was forced to perform under the threat of a bullhook. After the circus performance, at just 3 years old, Kenny was found dead in a stall. Benjamin was 4 years old when he drowned while swimming in a pond. Elephants are very strong swimmers. They love the water. They go in the water to cool off. Benjamin drowned because he was trying to escape his handler, who was chasing him with a bullhook. Witnesses reported that his handler had struck Benjamin near the shore, and Benjamin was going further and further out into the water. When the U.S. Department of Agriculture investigated, the investigator concluded that the use of the bullhook precipitated Benjamin's death. Yet no enforcement action was taken. After decades of failure under the Animal Welfare Act, our team, on behalf of a coalition, filed suit under the Endangered Species Act, which has a citizen suit provision, unlike the Animal Welfare Act, to try to help the elephants at Ringling Brothers. And it was at trial in that case that I came face to face in court with Gary Johnson, the owner, trainer, and handler of the very elephant I'd ridden at Marine World as a child. Also the owner, trainer, and handler of the elephant who was used in the movie Water for Elephants. Gary Johnson has been caught on video repeatedly beating elephants. Yet to this day, he has an Animal Welfare Act exhibitor license and continues to exhibit elephants as well as giraffes. Ringling brought him in as a purported expert witness. Ringling Brothers also continued to possess an Animal Welfare Act license, and at that point had never faced a single Animal Welfare Act enforcement action, not so much as a warning. Months after a 6-week-long trial, we finally got a decision. I was with my brother on a nostalgic trip to the Exploratorium Museum for his 30th birthday when I got the call. We had lost the case on procedural grounds. The court never even reached the merits, despite years of litigation, extensive discovery, and a 6-week-long trial. That loss made me more determined than ever to hold Ringling Brothers accountable for the animals it was abusing, but also to hold the U.S. Department of Agriculture accountable for enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. A few months later, I joined the PETA Foundation, where I would go on to create and direct the Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division. This is a team of veterinarians, lawyers, scientists, and others who advocate for captive wild animals used in entertainment, including elephants, as well as bears, lions, tigers, chimpanzees, and others. The team I built included a former student of mine who has gone on to become the leading expert on captive elephant issues in the United States, as well as our paralegal from the Ringling Brothers case, who went on to Vermont Law School and got her law degree. We continued to fight against Ringling Brothers, including relying on evidence that had come to light in the Endangered Species Act case. We never let up. And in 2015, Ringling Brothers finally announced that it would stop using elephants. Those elephants were recently transferred to a much better facility, and Ringling Brothers is relaunching without any animals at all. Our team also got other circuses to stop using wild animals or to close, and we were able to help a large number of animals, well over 100 animals, remove them from shoddy facilities where they were being abused and neglected to reputable sanctuaries, to shut down some of the worst facilities and end some of the cruelest practices. I've moved on to build other programs, but CALE, the Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division at the PETA Foundation, continues to do amazing work. Despite all of its successes, there are still thousands of animals suffering for entertainment in the United States. Animals who are supposed to be protected by the Animal Welfare Act. That is the focus of my discussion today, the Animal Welfare Act and animals who are used for exhibition. I'm going to start with a discussion of some threshold definitions, what it means to exhibit within the meaning of the Animal Welfare Act, and who is defined as an animal used for exhibition under the Animal Welfare Act. I'll then discuss the substance of the protections in place for those animals that are covered. And I'll discuss some practices that are very concerning that the USDA continues to allow under the Animal Welfare Act. Finally, I'll discuss how the Animal Welfare Act interacts with other laws that provide protections for animals used for exhibition. A key stated purpose of the Animal Welfare Act is to ensure that animals intended for use for exhibition purposes are provided humane care and treatment. As with any statute, we need to start with definitions. Here, there are 3 key definitional questions. First, who counts as an animal? Always a question in animal law. Next, what counts as exhibition within the meaning of the Animal Welfare Act? And finally, what is humane care and treatment? I'm going to start with the threshold question of exhibition. The Animal Welfare Act requires a license to exhibit animals, but what does it mean to exhibit? The statute does not define the term exhibit. It does define the term exhibitor, but not in a helpful way. The Animal Welfare Act defines exhibitor as any person exhibiting animals. The dictionary defines exhibit as to show or display publicly. The Animal Welfare Act does give us some examples of what counts as exhibition, including carnivals, circuses, zoos, all whether or not they're operated for profit. The Animal Welfare Act also specifically excludes certain activities from the definition of exhibition, which otherwise would fall within the ambit of the Animal Welfare Act. Excluded activities include state and county fairs, purebred cat and dog shows, rodeos, livestock shows, and fairs intended to advance agricultural arts and sciences. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, by regulation, has also excluded additional activities from the Animal Welfare Act. But given that these are not grounded in the statutory language, they're of questionable legality. Currently, for example, the USDA excludes dog racing from the definition of exhibit and does not regulate this industry. Despite these many carve-outs, many different types of activities are covered as exhibition under the Animal Welfare Act. This includes traveling acts of all sorts, zoos, including very large, well-funded zoos that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, such as the San Diego Zoo. But these only make up about 10% of all Animal Welfare Act licensed exhibitors. The rest are mostly small, roadside zoos, operations that allow activities such as public interactions with wild animals, petting, riding, photo ops. There are also game farms, which offer canned photography opportunities. Photographs on calendars and elsewhere that you think are wild animals are very often taken at these game farms, which also have long, well-documented records of animal abuse and neglect. Exhibition under the Animal Welfare Act also includes Hollywood, the use of animals for movies, shows, commercials. And I'm sorry to tell you, but the No Animals Were Harmed stamp of approval on movies does not mean a whole lot. The No Animals Were Harmed oversight does not include any training and does not include anything that occurs off-set. It has repeatedly been awarded despite documented abuse, neglect, and even animal deaths. There's also increasingly online exhibition, and this too is covered by the Animal Welfare Act. This includes activities on TikTok, YouTube, and other social media. So there's a very wide range of types of exhibition, ranging from large to small, reputable to disreputable, traveling to stationary, online, and in person. There's also a very wide range of animals used. So the next question is, which of those animals are covered by the Animal Welfare Act's oversight of exhibition? The definition of animal in the Animal Welfare Act is something I discuss in detail in my Animal Law Fundamentals overview of the Animal Welfare Act. Here, I'm going to focus on how this definition plays out specifically in the context of exhibition. Generally, the Animal Welfare Act covers warm-blooded animals. But horses, who of course are warm-blooded, are excluded when they're used for exhibition. As a result, horse racing, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, is not regulated under the Animal Welfare Act. Also, keep in mind that even if an animal might fall within the definition of animal in the Animal Welfare Act, there are some who are excluded by virtue of the activity they're being used for and the law's definition of exhibition. So again, rodeos, cat and dog shows, state and county fairs, livestock shows, and fairs to advance agriculture, arts, and sciences are excluded. And again, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, by questionably legal regulation, has excluded dog races as well from the definition of exhibition. So they're not covered, even though dogs normally are. Cold-blooded animals are entirely excluded from the definition of animal in the Animal Welfare Act. So this includes reptiles, like the many alligators on display at facilities across Florida. It also excludes the many millions of fish on display in aquariums across the United States. The Georgia Aquarium alone holds more than 100,000 fish. This also excludes a host of other animals, such as octopuses and other cephalopods. So now that we've defined the contours of exhibition and animal under the Animal Welfare Act, The next definitional question that we're going to dive into is what constitutes humane care and treatment under the Animal Welfare Act? What is actually required of those that are regulated? So a key purpose of the Animal Welfare Act is to ensure that animals used for exhibition are provided humane care and treatment. But what is humane care and treatment? This is not defined in the Animal Welfare Act. Instead, the Animal Welfare Act delegates to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to define requirements to ensure humane care and treatment. The USDA, in turn, frequently defers to veterinarians who are employed by the very exhibitors that they're supposed to be regulating. But there are certain minimum requirements that the Animal Welfare Act requires to be addressed. These are things that are focused on survival, not the things that an animal would need to flourish or to thrive. The Animal Welfare Act requires attention to food, water, shelter from weather and temperature extremes, basic veterinary care, ventilation. The Animal Welfare Act, with the exception of primates, which I'll discuss, does not explicitly require companionship for social animals. It does not require enrichment for animals. It does not require that they be able to fulfill their basic genetically driven needs. The Animal Welfare Act, to be clear, gives the U.S. Department of Agriculture the discretion and the authority to require such things. But for the most part, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has declined to do so, even when asked through petitions for rulemaking, and has instead done the bare minimum. As discussed in my Animal Law Fundamentals Animal Welfare Act overview, for the vast majority of animals, including bears, elephants, tigers, and others, there are no species-specific welfare regulations. There are very general regulations. But even for animals where there are more specific requirements in place, they're woefully outdated, they're inadequate, and they're poorly enforced. I'd like to discuss two examples of regulatory requirements that are more specific for animals who are frequently exhibited. First, primates, and second, marine mammals. In 1985, Congress amended the Animal Welfare Act to add specific welfare requirements for primates. The Animal Welfare Act now requires, quote, a physical environment adequate to promote the psychological well-being of primates. The author of this amendment, Senator John Melcher, a veterinarian from Montana, intended this requirement to require social companionship for primates. Notably, the Animal Welfare Act refers to non-human primates in recognition of the fact that humans are primates as well. Like us, most other primates are extremely social animals. It's well documented that primates suffer tremendously when they're denied their basic social needs. This can be evidenced through stereotypic behaviors, which are abnormal, repetitive activities such as rocking back and forth, pulling out one's own hair, finger sucking, repetitive eye poking, and so on. In fact, studies of non-human primates are used to condemn solitary confinement of human beings. As I detail in a book chapter that I wrote on solitary confinement and the Animal Welfare Act, when the Animal Welfare Act was amended to require this additional thing for primates, the U.S. Department of Agriculture initially proposed requiring social companionship unless a veterinarian determined that that would be harmful for the particular animal. But there was massive uproar from the experimentation industry that didn't want to have to change its practices. As a result, the U.S. Department of Agriculture backtracked, and the rule that it finalized was very different from the rule that it had initially proposed. And that rule, decades later, is still in effect today, despite legal challenges and failure to protect primates. The rule requires only that those with primates develop, document, and follow an appropriate plan for environment enhancement adequate to promote the psychological well-being of non-human primates. The plan is supposed to include specific provisions to address the social needs of primates, but the USDA made unequivocally clear that it was not requiring social housing, even at the same time that it recognized that social housing is better psychologically for primates. Repeated surveying internally of USDA inspectors has concluded that inspectors have been unable to assess whether or not this requirement of a plan is actually being complied with. and thus that they cannot enforce it. As a result, many, many primates are held alone at Animal Welfare Act licensed facilities. The USDA recognized decades ago that more guidance was necessary to enforce this requirement, but has never finalized such guidance. Inspectors and regulated entities alike have conveyed their view that as long as there's a plan in place, a piece of paper, the requirement has been met. Hundreds of exhibitors across the United States hold primates, and many of those primates are held alone. I've observed a number of them personally. Not only that chimpanzee on a tricycle at Marine World, but also all over the country at roadside zoos and traveling exhibits, sometimes engaged in abnormal behavior, a clear signal of their psychological distress. Primates are also one of the only categories of animals where the USDA has promulgated specific cage size requirements, engineering standards, rather than performance standards. Just as primates come in many sizes, from gorillas who can stand over 6 feet tall and weigh more than 500 pounds, to the pygmy mouse lemur, whose head and body is less than 2.5 inches tall and weighs just about an ounce, cage size requirements vary. But for the very largest primates, for our fellow great apes, gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees, the USDA requires only 25 square feet of floor space. That's 5 feet by 5 feet, not much bigger than a walk-in closet. Turning to the second category, marine mammals. This is the only other category of animals where the Animal Welfare Act has specific social companionship requirements in addition to primates, and one of the only other categories where there are also engineering requirements for space. To illustrate the inadequacy of even these requirements, I want to share the story of Lolita, also known as Tokutai and Skali, with you. Lolita is an orca who was taken from her home waters off the Puget Sound more than half a century ago. She's a member of the critically endangered southern resident killer whale pod. She's the only surviving captive member of her pod. In the wild, orcas swim up to 100 miles a day, and they dive hundreds of feet deep. Lolita is about 20 feet long. The tank she's been in for more than half a century is 20 feet at its very deepest and 80 feet across at its widest point. So Lolita cannot dive at all, and she cannot swim any meaningful distance. Orcas are extremely social animals, but Lolita has not seen another orca since her tank mate, Hugo, died in 1980 after ramming his head into the side of the tank repeatedly. Lolita's mother is still alive in the wild. When Lolita's been played recordings of her pod's unique dialect, she still responds to them. For decades, even with a social companionship requirement in place, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has signed off on Lolita's conditions and continued to license the Miami Seaquarium and to decline to take enforcement action against it, insisting that Lolita had enough space and that confining her in her tiny tank with Pacific white-sided dolphins, animals she would never interact with in the wild, animals who raked her skin with their teeth and caused wounds, met the social companionship requirement. So even in the rare instance where there are more specific, more detailed, more demanding regulatory requirements, which is not the case for most categories of animals, the promise of humane care and treatment has been unfulfilled. In short, currently, the USDA does not require much in terms of humane care and treatment. It has the ability to do much more, but it has not exercised that authority. What I want to turn to next are some very concerning practices that the U.S. Department of Agriculture continues to allow that are categorically inhumane and yet not prohibited under the Animal Welfare Act. The U.S. Department of Agriculture allows a great many categorically inhumane practices, despite its ability, and indeed its responsibility, to prohibit them under the Animal Welfare Act. I'm going to focus on just two of them today. First, public interactions, and second, forced performances by animals. Public interactions with captive wildlife can take a variety of forms. They include rides, like the ride I took on an elephant at Marine World as a child, photo ops, cub petting, and other animal encounters, which happens at a variety of roadside zoos across the United States and also at parking lots where traveling exhibitors will just set up. There's no denying that cubs and other baby animals are adorable, and it's extremely tempting to want to hold them, to pet them, and to have our photographs taken with them. But these interactions are harmful to the animals. In order to prepare them for public interactions, these babies are taken from their mothers prematurely. They're taken days, sometimes even hours after they're born, long before their immune systems have had an opportunity to develop. They're exposed to pathogens, and they also potentially expose others to zoonotic diseases. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has confirmed COVID in a host of captive animals in the United States, including tigers, lions, and primates. Yet these interactions continue to happen. A decade ago, a broad coalition led by the Humane Society of the United States, and including groups like the World Wildlife Fund and the Detroit Zoo, petitioned the U.S. Department of Agriculture to exercise its clear authority to stop allowing these interactions and to prohibit them. Despite its ability and responsibility to prohibit these cruel interactions, the USDA has simply let the petition languish. The second category I want to discuss is forced performances by animals. Circus acts with animals have waned in popularity in recent years, and their prevalence has declined. But they're not gone. Animals are still forced to perform in circuses. Elephants are crisscrossing the country to perform in a different town nearly every day as I speak. Animals are also forced to perform for movies, TV, and commercials, and for a variety of other forms of entertainment. They're forced through tools like the bullhook. Consider Nosy. Nosy is an elephant who was taken from the wild in Zimbabwe after witnessing the slaughter of her family in a government-sponsored cull. Nosy was shipped to the United States and spent decades alone without the company of a single other elephant, despite the extreme sociality of elephants. Nosy was forced to perform for circuses across the United States, including shrine circuses, the Universal Circus, and others. She was crammed into a tiny, dark, dank trailer and traveled across the United States. In 2004, a whistleblower came forward and reported that electric prods were frequently used on Nosy and described an incident in which Nosy's handler beat her in the dark with a bullhook while Nosy was staked down by 4 legs. The whistleblower further reported that Nosy's handler encouraged others to join in with other objects, including a sledgehammer and shovel handles. Nosy's situation was not unique. This is standard elephant training and elephant handling. The trainers of the elephant that I rode as a child at Marine World were caught on video engaged in virtually identical behavior. Similar fear and violence-based methods are used for other captive wild animals. For example, primates, like the chimpanzee I saw riding a tricycle at Marine World, are beaten into submission. Joe, the chimpanzee, spent nearly 2 decades alone in a barren enclosure at a roadside zoo in Mobile, Alabama, where they encouraged patrons to throw peanuts at him. Joe was discarded by Hollywood when he was about 10 years old after he got too big and too dangerous to be used. He stayed at the Mobile Zoo until my team at the PETA Foundation was able to rehome him to Save the Chimps, an accredited sanctuary in Florida. On his way to Save the Chimps, Joe got to meet Jane Goodall. Chimpanzees are becoming less common on exhibition, and the Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division at the PETA Foundation has rehomed most of the solitary chimpanzees who were on exhibit, but other primates are still being used very widely and forced to perform. Just about a mile from the studio where I am right now is the address of a licensed exhibitor who supplies animals for what's called a monkey rodeo, an act in which monkeys are strapped to the backs of dogs and forced to race around, traveling from fair to fair in different towns. Other similar exhibits are prevalent. Nosy and Joe, at least, are both in sanctuary now. But that's no thanks to the U.S. Department of Agriculture or the Animal Welfare Act. It took other laws to help these animals, and that's what I want to turn to next, how the Animal Welfare Act interacts with other laws that provide protections to animals used for exhibition. I'm now going to talk about how the Animal Welfare Act interacts with other laws that provide protections for animals used for exhibition. This interaction is extremely important given the U.S. Department of Agriculture's failure to meaningfully protect animals used for exhibition under the Animal Welfare Act. There are a number of state and local laws that also apply to animals used for exhibition, and the Federal Endangered Species Act also affords some protection to them. First, state cruelty laws. Every state in the United States has a cruelty to animals law. It prohibits typically unnecessary or unjustifiable suffering or neglect of an animal. Each state's law is different, but they generally have broad prohibitions. The Animal Welfare Act makes clear that it does not preempt the application of such laws to animals who are also regulated by the USDA under the Animal Welfare Act. The application of cruelty laws has proved useful to a number of animals on exhibition who've been failed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Nosy, for example, was seized by local law enforcement in Alabama under Alabama state laws. Typically, however, those tasked with enforcing state cruelty laws are not eager to get involved when they're USDA licensed exhibitors. Those charged with enforcing state cruelty laws tend to be under-resourced, overwhelmed by America's cat and dog overpopulation crisis, and to lack the expertise and training in captive wildlife issues. Over and over again in my career, I have reported violations of state and local laws to authorities, and they've come back and said they're not going to step in because the USDA has jurisdiction and it's the USDA's responsibility. Sometimes they're even ignorant about their authority and believe that the Animal Welfare Act preempts their authority. But even when they're disabused of this ignorance, they're not willing to step in. More and more state and local officials are stepping up to help animals who are in their jurisdiction and suffering because the USDA is not helping them. And I hope that this trend continues. Cruelty laws can play a critically important role, particularly in the most egregious cases. But they cannot be a substitute for the Animal Welfare Act because the Animal Welfare Act is a regulatory regime that provides broad oversight of facilities. Cruelty laws are criminal laws that do not involve any inspections, that have high burdens of proof. Any abuse or neglect needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, mens rea requirements, and exemptions. So they're quite challenging to enforce, and they cannot be a substitute for a meaningfully implemented Animal Welfare Act. But they can be a check in the most serious cases. Next, I'd like to talk about local laws, which have started to play a really important role in protecting animals failed by the USDA. Numerous local jurisdictions have banned bullhooks, and that was a reason cited by the Ringling Brothers Circus in its decision to stop using elephants. Following the lead of local governments, a number of states, including Rhode Island and California, have now also banned bullhooks in legislation that I worked on. Hundreds of local governments have banned or restricted the use of animals in traveling acts. And states are now also starting to get in on the action here, including California, Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York. There's similar efforts happening internationally, and there's federal legislation that has been introduced as well. But most of the progress has been made on the local level, and that has then eventually percolated up to the state level. These bans have been a really important mechanism to help animals when the USDA has refused to prohibit some of these cruel practices. The last law I'd like to talk about is the Federal Endangered Species Act, which you may not realize also applies to captive animals. Most folks think of the Endangered Species Act as a law that protects animals in the wild and protects our habitats. And it does do that. It does that very well. But the Endangered Species Act is clear that it also protects members of species that are listed as threatened or endangered, whether or not they're in captivity, whether or not they were born in captivity. And importantly, unlike the Animal Welfare Act, the Endangered Species Act has a citizen suit provision allowing private parties to get into court. Among other things, the Endangered Species Act prohibits harming, harassing, wounding, and killing protected animals. The lawsuit I mentioned at the beginning against Ringling Brothers under the Endangered Species Act was the first such case to go to trial. But in the years since then, there have been numerous other Endangered Species Act cases brought against USDA licensed exhibitors and they've been successful. With my colleagues, Dr. Heather Raleigh and Jared Goodman, I recently published a chapter on the application of the Endangered Species Act to captive wildlife that details a number of these cases. There are more such cases currently underway, and we'll continue to see them. It was because of the Endangered Species Act that we were able to get Joe the chimpanzee to sanctuary. And it was because of the Endangered Species Act that PETA's Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division has been able to rehome dozens of big cats held by the scofflaws featured in Netflix's Tiger King and shut down some of the worst cub petting operations, ending their cycles of abuse. The PETA Foundation has established important precedent, established that things like premature maternal separation and public handling of endangered lions, tigers, and hybrids violates the Endangered Species Act. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has also been bringing lawsuits and establishing solid precedent that things like solitary confinement, failure to provide veterinary care, and confining animals in filthy conditions violates the Endangered Species Act. This is a critical tool to help animals failed by the USDA, but it only applies to animals who happen to belong to a species that's listed under the Endangered Species Act as either threatened or endangered. The vast majority of Animal Welfare Act regulated animals are not covered. So there have been numerous cases where plaintiffs have been able to go in and remove endangered animals while having to leave behind other animals who weren't entitled to the Endangered Species Act protections and were being failed by the USDA. So we need more. We need to use these tools that we have. We need to recognize that there's clear authority for all of these laws to be applied in addition to the Animal Welfare Act, but we also need more. And that's what I'll talk about in my conclusion. To summarize, despite the promise of the Animal Welfare Act for animals used for exhibition, the fact of the matter is that there are thousands of animals across the United States used for entertainment who do not have adequate oversight. Many animals are completely excluded from these protections by virtue of the Animal Welfare Act's definitions. Both the definition of animal, which excludes horses used for exhibition and excludes all cold-blooded animals, such as alligators on alligator parks in Florida, fish in aquariums, and many others. Still more animals are excluded by the definition of exhibitor, which carves out rodeos, purebred cat and dog shows, and other types of exhibition. Even for those animals who are clearly entitled to protections under the Animal Welfare Act, the protections are minimal, and even the animals who are given the most detailed, specific, and rigorous requirements, like primates and marine mammals, they are not adequately enforced, they are outdated, and they do not provide sufficient protection for these animals. So animals like Joe the chimpanzee and Lolita the orca suffer on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's watch. The U.S. Department of Agriculture continues to allow practices that are inherently inhumane, despite its ability and its responsibility to step in and prohibit them. This includes things like forced performances and public interactions with captive wild animals. Fortunately, the Animal Welfare Act does not preempt other laws, and courts have repeatedly recognized this. So there is some relief for at least some animals used for exhibition under state cruelty laws, under local bans on things like bullhooks and traveling wild animal acts, and increasingly state bans as well. And there's a layer of protection under the Federal Endangered Species Act for animals used for exhibition who happen to belong to a listed species. These are important tools, but they're patchwork tools, and they cannot substitute for a meaningfully enforced Animal Welfare Act. I have some recommendations of next steps of things we can do to improve the situation. The first is simply to take personal responsibility, to not be complicit in the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of animals for entertainment, even if animals are not suffering in a way that's visible to the naked eye, to a layperson. It's important that you do a little research, that you know before you go to a facility what its record is. Unfortunately, it can be quite difficult to know whether or not a facility is reputable. We know that an Animal Welfare Act license doesn't mean a whole lot. Increasingly, Facilities are exploiting public concerns about animal welfare by using words like sanctuary, refuge, and rescue in their names. An analysis I published a few years ago in the Animal Studies Journal found that fewer than 8% of Animal Welfare Act licensed exhibitors who are using these sorts of words are actually accredited sanctuaries. The Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, or GFAS, is the gold standard accrediting body for sanctuaries. GFAS requires compliance with rigorous requirements that are much more detailed than those required by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and include both affirmative requirements that are rooted in the specific needs of specific species, as well as prohibitions on some of the most harmful activities, including things like breeding more animals into captivity, public encounters, and forced performances. A facility's engagement in any of these activities, breeding, public encounters, or performances, should all be a red flag. GFAS's website, sanctuaryfederation.org, makes it very easy to look up whether a particular facility is accredited and also to look up accredited facilities near you. As long as patrons spend money to go to facilities that are substandard, harmful exhibitors and harmful exploitation of animals for entertainment will persist. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is not going to shut it down. So it's critically important that you don't support these facilities and also that you educate others. I truly believe that most people care about animals and do not want to be complicit in their abuse or their neglect. They simply don't realize what happens behind the scenes, the complexity of the USDA's failure to enforce even the most basic requirements. They want to do the right thing. They simply aren't aware. You can help by educating them. It's also important to understand that you need to educate yourself not only about places that you go to physically, but where the animals are coming from when you see them in the media you consume, whether that's in social media, movies, TV, or even photographs on things like calendars. The stamp of approval, no animals were harmed, does not mean much. So long as captive wildlife are used for entertainment without adequate legal oversight, they're likely to suffer, whether that's in training, in transportation, or both. When animals are used for entertainment, especially for profit, their needs are not going to be put first. There's no reason to continue to exploit animals for entertainment, especially now when we have CGI and all sorts of other amazing technology. We also have access to incredible footage of animals in their natural habitats, engaged in natural behavior, which is both much more educational and much more interesting than observing an animal engage in abnormal stereotypic behavior, like swaying back and forth in a small captive situation. It's also very important to be aware that many so-called wildlife photographs, including stock images, are staged. There may well be a handler just outside the view of the camera. These animals are frequently abused and neglected. Some of them are even used to supply canned hunts. There's also a growing body of scientific evidence that documents that images, particularly images where humans are shown in direct contact with imperiled species, can harm conservation efforts in the wild. So it's important to be an ethical, conscientious consumer and to educate others. That's the key first step. Beyond that, you can also urge better laws at every level. At the federal level, there are a number of bills currently pending that you can reach out to your lawmaker and ask them to support. There are also a growing number of efforts along these lines on the state level, and especially on the local level. You don't need to be an expert of any sort to initiate an effort to protect animals in your community at your local government. There are lots of resources available to you, and I encourage you to take advantage of them. The last thing I want to say, and I want to make it very clear, is that I think there's hope. I've painted a pretty bleak picture about the USDA's failings and the suffering of animals as a result. But I do feel hopeful, and I wouldn't be doing this work if I didn't. In the 15 years that I've been practicing animal law so far, I've seen tremendous progress. Nosy the elephant, Joe the chimpanzee, and so many others are now in sanctuary. Most of the solitary chimpanzees who were on exhibit are now in sanctuary. Most circuses have stopped exploiting animals. States and local governments have stepped in to ban some of the worst abuses. Marine World in my hometown is now Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. It does still exhibit a few dozen animals. It still has problems, unfortunately, but it no longer has any chimpanzees, any elephants or elephant rides, and it no longer exhibits orcas. As Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I believe this, and I'm confident that we're going to continue to see progress in this area. And I'm energized by the students that I'm training to be animal advocacy leaders in the Vermont Law School Animal Law and Policy Institute. And I hope that you will choose to be a part of the solution as well. For Animal Law Fundamentals, this is Delcianna Winders.